My name is Joe Horne. I'm Community Development Director for Williamson County Government. And I'd like to welcome you to Community Development 101. For those of you who aren't aware, community development handles developmental services for an incorporated county. And with in conjunction with Mayor Rogers Anderson's office, we are putting together a series of shows to sort of talk about what the department does and sort of give our customers, the citizens of Williamson County, an idea of what to expect if and when they come in contact with one of our offices. Today, I'd like to welcome Floyd Heflin, who is Engineering Director for the county, and Michael Scott, who's Stormwater Coordinator for the county, and we're going to talk a little bit about stormwater today. But before we do that, I guess just to acquaint people in the public about Michael and Floyd. Floyd, tell us a little about yourself and your qualifications and such.
Thank you, Joe. I have a degree in engineering from Vanderbilt and a master's from University of Memphis, and I've been here 20 years working for the county. Started in January of 1999, and before that I worked for Metro Nashville a couple of years, and then I've worked in consulting a little bit, and I've worked for the state of Tennessee TDEC.
Very good. And Michael, what about yourself?
Thanks, Joe. So I graduated from Middle Tennessee State University and then attended University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and I did a master's in biosystems engineering technology. I've been with the county for a little over 14 years, started in 2005, and been doing stormwater. I started out as the inspector and now the coordinator for the stormwater program.
Oh, very good, very good. Well, since our concept today is that of stormwater, thought it'd be helpful rather than assume that everybody in the audience knows exactly what we do in the area of stormwater. I thought it'd be helpful to run a short video that was put together by the Tennessee Stormwater Association. It's a 2 to 3 minute video, and it should give the folks an idea what stormwater is and the different aspects to that. So if we can run that video.
The Tennessee Stormwater Association is committed to helping protect and improve the quality of the waters of Tennessee. They serve as the lifeblood of Tennessee, the arteries of commerce and recreation. They're Tennessee's rivers, streams, and lakes. Heavy rains can do far more than ruin a commute or a picnic. Excess stormwater can destabilize streams, disrupt aquatic habitat, and cause increased water treatment costs. Precipitation in the form of snow or rain becomes stormwater when it melts or flows off the landscape, developing the land with roads, buildings, parking lots, and other construction activities can create impervious surfaces, and this can lead to environmental dangers. When precipitation falls on these impervious surfaces, it's unable to soak into the ground to recharge the water table or to be used by trees and plant life. Instead, the water collects and runs off these hard surfaces. As it runs off, it can collect pollutants along the way in the form of sediments, metals, oil, and grease, even bacteria and viruses from wildlife or pets. All of this runoff ends up in our streams and lakes. But there are solutions. Methods for reducing stormwater pollution come in many shapes and sizes. They range from everyday housekeeping to elegantly designed treatment systems, disposing of pet waste properly, following erosion control practices at construction sites, and installing green infrastructure are just a few examples of actions that positively affect stormwater quality. Reducing stormwater pollution makes our communities cleaner and safer places to live, work, and play. You can learn more about stormwater runoff at tnstormwater.org/stormwater.
Okay. That video threw out a number of topics, and I'd like to sort of go over a few of those topics. Historically, stormwater regulation was sort of an idea of quantity was the old one. How much water might run off my property and whether or not it will impact my neighbors. But we're now going into the quality aspect of that. Floyd, can you speak a little to that?
Yeah, I think when I first started, like you said, mainly the focus, we were looking at quantity. And the main control, that we saw used was just a typical dry detention pond to try and slow the water down so that, it didn't have an adverse impact on downstream properties. And that was the biggest issue, is what we do, and even now with quality, is trying to avoid any adverse impacts to off-site properties, whether it be from flooding or from erosion.
Okay. So the quality aspect, I guess we don't see many concrete swales anymore, for example.
Well, that's true, and the only time we would see something like a concrete swell would usually be in the bottom of a detention pond where they don't have enough slope, typically 1 to 1.5%, to allow it to drain out efficiently after a storm, and we may still have a small low flow concrete channel in the bottom of a detention pond. But other than that, you're right. The impervious surfaces we try to avoid as much as possible. As far as the pollutants that come off of those, we know we've got houses, we know we've got roads, so now we have to use additional controls to help take those particulates and sediment out of the water before it gets to the creek.
I see. Well, why don't we take a short step back? One of the things we talked about was flood protection. I know this county has a number of streams, Harpeth River perhaps being the most prominent of that, and talk a little bit about how we handle flood protection in the unincorporated county.
Yeah, well, we don't allow any new development to create lots in the floodplain. The only exception being maybe a large lot subdivision where you could have some floodplain on the parcel, but it couldn't be in the building envelope. But for major subdivisions, all floodplain, FEMA designated floodplain, has to be in open space. So that goes a long ways to keep people out of harm's way, and I think it's helped us immensely in the county.
I see. Well, we also discussion about the whole idea of post-development versus pre-development runoff. What used to be kind of a one-to-one relationship. Is that still true?
Well, yeah, the main rule of thumb is that your post-developed runoff should not exceed the pre-developed flow rate through the 100-year storm. And essentially the 100-year storm is the storm that has a 1% chance in any given year of occurring. So the controls, mainly, like we said, detention ponds are sized and modeled so that the discharge from those, once again slowing it down, don't exceed that pre-developed discharge rate. Now, the overall volume is still quite likely going to be greater over time, but at least it will control that or buffer that runoff so that it doesn't increase downstream floodplains.
I know during your tenure you were lucky enough to be in charge of the flood program after the rather significant floods we had some years back. Did we learn anything from that?
Well, yeah, I think we learned that we were fortunate to not have a lot of development early on that was in the floodplain or next to creeks. The homes that got damaged were mainly homes that were built in subdivisions that were built in the 70s, and these homes were in some situations right next to the creek. And obviously, that we didn't have the waterway natural areas that we have today, and those, to keep people kind of off the creek and give the creek room to meander, as well as let its natural floodplain do its thing. So, but that we saw before the flood of 2010. I think we had a total of 700, maybe 1,000 in damages, and that went to 7 million basically after the flood. And that's back to 1978.
I see. Well, I don't want to, I wouldn't want to try to characterize that flood. I know during that time, this is a 200 year, this is a 500 year, but it was just a significant event.
It was, and it depended on, where you were at in the county, but it was, most people assumed that it was somewhere, once you got north of Franklin, it was somewhere between the 100 and 500 year storm and flood event.
One other thing before we kind of switch our focus over to stormwater too, is that, the floodplain is not static, particularly the whole mapping of the floodplain. Can you explain why that's the case?
Well, I mean, some communities don't regulate to the extent that Williamson County does, so they may allow more development in the floodplain as long as they elevate the structures to, 1 foot above, 3 foot above, whatever their regulation is. And if you do that, then you will eventually be causing some increase in the flood elevations, and that might be remapped, and that might increase the floodplain area. But of course, our intent in the way that we regulate it is that new development not cause, an increase. But what is going on is some of these studies were done back in the 70s, and they didn't have accurate topo. And so when we go back now and redo those, it's going to change the delineation of the floodplain.
I see. Well, we'll shift over a little bit and let Michael talk for a few minutes. Michael, right now, erosion prevention and stormwater quality is a special emphasis. Now, one of the things we hear a lot about, at least in even the public perhaps does, is about an MS4 program. Just a thumbnail definition. What do you mean by an MS4 program?
Well, Joe, an MS4 program is a municipal separate storm sewer system. And so basically across the state of Tennessee, there's, I forget the number, but for the counties and a lot of the cities, many of the counties, not all of them, and a lot of the cities are MS4s. And of course, the major cities as well, they're large MS4s. We're small MS4s in Williamson County due to our population. But basically, that is how our stormwater is handled, and where it's routed, how it's going to be going into the system.
Well, when you talk about Williamson County being an MS4 program, we're talking, just want to remind everybody, we're talking about the unincorporated county, because I believe in one or several of the other communities in the county, Brentwood, Franklin, and the like, have their own stormwater programs.
That's correct. Each city typically has their own. I think the majority of the cities in Williamson County have their own MS4 program. Not all of them do, but most of them do.
I see. Well, in Floyd's discussion, we alluded to, and in the video itself, we alluded to the fact that stormwater quality is very important. And it has to do with filtering of pollutants. Can you speak to that very briefly, perhaps augment what Floyd has already said?
Sure. So stormwater quality, I mean, there's different elements of that. There's construction stormwater quality, there's post-construction stormwater quality. Basically, it's during construction, it would be the implementation of controls, erosion and sediment controls, to prevent mud from getting into the MS4 system, which is either the county controlled highways and ditches or a stream.
I see.
As far as post-construction, or once a development is constructed and built and finished and there's houses, then you have a different type of stormwater quality. It's permanent. It's like could be a pond, or in some cases you may have bioretention. You may have pavers, pervious pavers. You may have swells or ditches that are lined with grass, different things like that that help to address stormwater pollutants.
I see. But we also, one thing we talked a little bit about as well is impervious surfaces. And there is I wouldn't necessarily call it a movement, but there is, we would like to minimize the use of impervious surfaces as much as possible.
Sure. Yeah, because impervious surfaces basically is shifting from a natural state where you have infiltration of runoff into the ground that goes into base flow and slowly, goes into the local streams and water bodies, to a state where you may have an impervious surface that channels that. And if there's not controls in place, it could direct it into a stream or a river, increasing velocity, increasing the discharge rate into that. So impervious surfaces typically in some of the state requirements that have come out in the last few years have been to address that and to promote types of infiltration like bioretention.
I see. But it's not just, I think everyone thinks of stormwater quality, perhaps. They look at I guess they look at a muddy stream after a storm, which to some extent, that's a natural process, I would say. Just,
It is, it is a natural process. You have natural stream bank erosion. You also have other things that are not regulated by us, such as agriculture and forestry. Those are not anything that we have any jurisdiction to regulate. We are for development type activities. Specifically, if you're grading over an acre, and there's some other things in our ordinance that that we do permit. But yeah, when a stream gets silty, there can be a lot of causes for that. So you have to typically go upstream, see what's going on, go downstream, and see kind of what's going on to be able to assess whether or not that is something that would be a regulated thing.
but it's not just the silt that you see. There's other pollutants into the water too that this program attempts to address.
Sure, yeah, because there's some nutrients that bind to silt, like phosphorus. They can go into streams and cause algal blooms and things like that are not healthy. You have other lots of contaminants that can run in the stormwater. So by slowing that down and by putting that into a bioretention or something that's going to infiltrate that typically can filter out a lot of those impurities.
Well, I guess this gets toward to some of the techniques we use now, as opposed to past techniques. I know, we spoke briefly before of impervious surfaces, but it's not just a rooftop. Driveways, impervious surfaces. Streets, of course, are, and they have their own bit of contribution to water quality issues as well.
Sure, streets, parking lots, roofs, all those are impervious surfaces that can cause, especially when added together, can be an issue as far as stormwater quality. So I guess the objective is to slow that down and to try to put that into a place that's not going directly into a stream or a river, is to maybe a conservation area or sheet flow or something that has the ability to slow it down, slow the runoff down, and help promote infiltration so that you're not taking those potential contaminants directly into a water body.
Okay, well, I mentioned to Floyd earlier too. It's just that standard of using a grass swell that produces some degree of filtration, as opposed, and also it likely can also slow the runoff.
There's lots of different treatments and lots of different things that you can do, especially when used together, can produce some pretty good results as far as controlling stormwater quality. A filter strip is a very good and widely used control method. It depends on the size of the project. It depends on how much impervious surface we're trying to treat. All those are factors, and a lot of times you may have to use something in addition to a filter strip, or depending on how the land lays and how steep it is and the proximity to the MS4 system or to a stream, a filter strip may be just enough of a treatment to keep that site within the guidelines of the state requirements.
I see. Well, there's a phrase, I guess a phrase of art now, a waterway natural area. And we talk about the Harpeth River being being the, I guess, the major water body we have in this county, but there's also countless number of streams and near streams. And I know that when you look at a set of, particularly in a subdivision, you'll see what's called a WENA, which is a waterway natural area. And talk about the value of why we maintain those for the maintenance of the stormwater system.
Well, a waterway natural area is basically supposed to be a non-disturbance area that runs along a stream. The sizes of those, or the width of those, can vary from 50 feet up to 100 feet. And those are areas where we really don't want to have a lot of, or any disturbance, or any types of heavy maintenance. I mean, if you have trees that are dead or dying, or invasives that are coming in, we understand the need to be able to remove those types of things. But you want to have those areas mainly as a natural area, and what that does is it helps in a lot of aspects to control stormwater as far as filtering of pollutants. You have just keeping those areas stable, the banks stable for not undercutting. Typically, a channel or a stream is going to want to undercut or want to erode and have banks that typically may fall into the channel as water goes down through the channel or through the stream. And so a waterway natural area, if you have trees and things like that are there, the roots will help hold that together. So it's really a good thing for stormwater, I think.
I see. Well, one thing I know we spend a lot of time, I guess, on the regulatory side is the erosion control. To go back to, I guess, the old tried and true means of stormwater control. But we have erosion control at a number of levels. I know we have them at a mass grading site, which would be, let's say, a subdivision, a large non-residential development and the like. And there's a series of erosion control plans. What does a typical erosion control plan consist of?
Well, I think for large subdivisions, the one we see that's most critical is a sediment basin. Mm-hmm. And a sediment basin can look pretty much like similar to a retention pond or a wet detention pond, because it has a permanent pool of water in it during construction. Now, a lot of times those get converted after the homes are built to a regular dry detention pond. But during construction, it will have a riser pipe or an outlet structure that allows that water to draw down slowly after a storm to give the sediment time to settle out of that water, so that you don't get as much sediment in the creeks downstream.
We also do checks on individual lots as well during the construction process.
Yeah, and the thing with the sediment pond, the state requires, if you have more than a certain area that's draining to one location and you're working in that area, that you may have to use a sediment pond. And we run into, more and more that a subdivision is going to have, at least one, maybe two, maybe three or more sediment ponds. But yeah, like you said, then you get up into the lot level controls or the other controls that you typically might be familiar with, like silt fence and a sediment trap instead of a sediment pond, which is not going to hold water indefinitely. It's just got like a stone check dam perhaps in an area where it can slow the water down so that sediment can drop out behind it. But that is one thing that has helped a lot too, is that since 2005, when our stormwater regulations went into effect, we have been requiring individual site plans for each lot to show how they're going to install and utilize their erosion controls to keep as much sediment as possible on site.
I see. One of the things that changed with 2005 too is we do have an enforcement mechanism now, and it's in the matter of fines. I know we've collected quite a bit. I think something over $100,000 in 2018.
Yeah, 2018 was $109,000 and change just in fines, and then of course we charge for land disturbance permits. And, those are $300 for a subdivision or non-residential site, and $150 for a single lot.
I see.
And then if someone wants to go to the Stormwater Appeals Board, there's a $100 fee to go to the Stormwater Appeals Board. But yeah, that has helped offset the cost of the program.
I see. I see. You mentioned very briefly Stormwater Appeals Board. I know we're running out of time, but I guess that's since that subject's out there, I guess we should speak to it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it was formed basically when we got notice from the state in the early 2000s that we had to get a program in place because we were going to be considered an MS4, as Michael talked about. The mayor appointed a committee, Citizens Advisory Committee, for to determine how that stormwater regulation was going to take place, and we had a consultant, Camp Dresser McKee, who took us through several meetings and the process of developing those regulations and coming up with the buffers and the different items that we were going to use to regulate, as well as define what the fines were going to be and how we were going to enforce. So, since 2005, that then kind of transitioned into the Stormwater Appeals Board, that has representatives from various, walks of life in the community, and we've got an agricultural rep, we've got, a building rep, we've got an environmental rep, a homeowners rep, a member of the county commission. So it's a pretty diverse group, and if somebody wants to appeal anything in those regulations or seek a waiver of those regulations, they can come and ask the board for that.
I see. Well, what if you are an individual citizen and you see something that you think is amiss? People do call in complaints, do they not?
Absolutely, and we'll respond to phone calls, or they can actually. Michael set up a link on our website if you go through engineering or stormwater, isn't that right? Where they can actually attach files, attach pictures, or if there's something they're questioning, if they think they're being impacted by a development, or if there's an issue that they're concerned with, they can submit an email through that link, and we'll check into it.
Oh, very good. Well, very good. I'm sure we can arrange for in this presentation to at least give some links across the screen so everybody can come in and let us know whether there's a problem, because after all, this is a big county. It's kind of hard, sometimes the only time we find out about problems is through these phone calls. But I know we're running out of time. I guess to sum up the importance of this program, I guess I'd ask you, Michael, what would you recommend to anybody that is interested in developing or interested in what is going on around them in a new subdivision?
Well, there's lots of resources online. You've got the Tennessee Stormwater Association, you've got the Williamson County website, as well as the state site. I would say just be aware that there are regulations and that there are specific things that you have to do. And most of the developers and builders know that. I mean, we've been doing this for a long time. As far as, when there is a problem, feel free to let us know or to go to that website and fill out a complaint form. We'll take a look at it. It is important to note that not just because there is silt in the street does not necessarily mean it's an illicit discharge or something that we would regulate. It depends on really whether or not there is mud and silt entering the Williamson County storm system or into a waters of the state. And so those are all things that we have to consider when doing any type of enforcement or regulatory type action. There's just a lot of things that you have to look at, I think. But overall, the objective is really to keep the streams and waterways clean, as clean as possible.
And that's a good point that Michael makes, is that, a lot of times people can be overly sensitive to, if they see, if it hasn't rained in a while, or if it's during the summer and it rains and they see water ponding in their yard, they may get upset. But it may be that that's, not an issue. And in some ways, that's even perhaps beneficial in allowing more infiltration into the ground. So that's not something we necessarily look at. When we look at individual lot site plans, the code requires they have a certain slope away from the house within a certain distance from the house. But when it gets out to people's yards, people do their own landscaping. They hire people to do landscaping. You're going to have areas where you don't have, a positive flow of water, and you may have some ponding that's not really an issue.
Well, gentlemen, I appreciate you joining us on this program, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in to Community Development 101, and we look forward to coming to you again on other topics. Thank you very much.